Thank you. Thanks for inviting me to speak and to thank you all for coming today. So I'm talking on a topic, well, the Bauhaus centenary is this year, and actually there's another project that came out of the other modernist studies ones we're doing about a lot of emigres, exiles, internees that ended up in Australia due to fleeing Nazism from about 1930 to 1960. So this is one snippet from this project, and it's not exactly from the project, but it's a side view I'm developing for this year to think about the Bauhaus legacy and what it means. Okay? So I'll talk about this angle. Okay, I will read a bit, and then there's a little section I have to explain through images, so I'll do it from there. So what took my interest was that last October I saw a letter in eFlux. You know eFlux is a zeitgeist-obsessed art online journal, or discussion forum. And it posted a letter that condemned the Bauhaus in Dessau for prohibiting a performance by the band Panesana Fischfilet. This group, okay? Very interestingly named group. So the signatures of the letter, which included many prominent German artists and architects, asked the Bauhaus Dessau Foundation to live up to the slogan displayed on its promotional material, "The Bauhaus, not a style, but a stance." The letter was adamant that this act of censorship, banning this band from playing, violated the Bauhaus stance. The situation, of course, was complicated in Germany at the time because a left-wing band was being prevented from playing at Dessau, at much the same time that some people from the AfD were being invited to speak officially at the University of Siegen. So you had this left-wing censorship and right-wing permission. The final paragraph of the protest letter sums up its main point. Quote, "This is unworthy of the cultural life of a free country. We demand that in future, at least half the staff of the Supervisory Committee of Cultural Institutions be representatives from civil society, not political parties. Only in this way can the legacy of the historic Bauhaus be preserved and the slogan currently shown on the Foundation's promotional material be fulfilled." Quote, "The Bauhaus, not a style, but a stance." So, of course, I think most of us can probably agree with the general sentiment, but what really triggered my interest was that they could readily identify the stance. And if you know anything about the Bauhaus, this is quite complicated to try and figure out what its stance is and what it means today. So this is basically what the paper's about. Okay? So the Bauhaus director, the Dessau director, Claudia Parent, issued a statement explaining that the decision had nothing to do with Panesana Fischfilet. Actually, she said she'd never heard the band play, but apologised for not communicating the reasons properly. Some of the reasons were that it's UNESCO heritage building, so there can't be any as a director, she's actually responsible if it gets damaged, etc. But this is not what I want to go into. As I said, I just want to find out how you can identify so readily this idea of the stance. As a master, and I already know, maybe some of you do know, that the Bauhaus was a very complex institution. And I just want to talk about a few ways of looking at it. In introducing this book here, The Bauhaus Idea and Bauhaus Politics of 1991, the Hungarian art historian Eva Forgás, she's almost apologising for writing about the Bauhaus at that time. She says she acknowledges that the situation in 1991 was not sympathetic to the Bauhaus. Quote, this is how she, in introducing the book, she says, "The Bauhaus today appears as austere and unimaginative, almost militantly disciplined. Postmodern taste has had enough of programs and objectives anchored in the distant future, and is especially repelled by the subordination of the arts to anything of the sort, that is, programmatic programs." So Forgás was writing when the Soviet Union had barely dissolved, but she's still clear that, despite this apology, that the Bauhaus is worth talking about, and she sets out to show that its history was fascinatingly complex. Her book is really quite a neat distillation of the politics within and without the Bauhaus, and particularly about the politics that Gropius, the director, is mediating between the local authorities in Weimar, who are quite conservative, and the politics within the Bauhaus about what the stance actually means. And the picture she paints is one of constant struggle, perennial debate, and fluctuating fortunes. So that's 1991. If you flick forward 20 years later, many of you have probably seen this book or have a copy. It's published in 2009. And in the introduction to this book, Bauhaus, the Conceptual Model, which is a large exhibition and this massive, thick catalogue, Anne-Marie Jägi remarks how popular the Bauhaus had become, so the story's turned. She says, despite all the criticism, its reputation is spreading internationally. She notes, quote, the swiftly rising volume of publications, the escalating attendance figures, not only for Dessau, but Berlin and Weimar, as well as all the hits on the internet and all the words in print. So particularly if you put in Bauhaus, it just proliferates all this. So what's happened, and I think this is still part of this continuing story where it's becoming, the interest is proliferating up to this point. Jägi supports Mies van der Rohe's contention that the reason the Bauhaus endured was because it survived as an idea, or as a proposition, if you like. Such resonance cannot be achieved through organisation nor through propaganda, Mies argued. To quote him, only the idea has the force to disseminate itself so widely, unquote. Hence the exhibition, the publication. Again, insisted on the key thing here is the stance, the attitude, the proposition, although in her case she's saying it's transformed in the 20 years from the earlier publication. So of course in all these things there's an argument about this stance, this attitude, this proposition, but it's really increasingly unclear what it is. You would think the Bauhaus is actually maybe a nice building, or it's all the famous personalities that were there, or even the objects they produced, but no, it's this stance that it tends to be the thing, the crucial issue. And this is complicated because during its existence, the Bauhaus was constantly vilified, sometimes on the progressive left for being too petit bourgeois. That is, it's too absorbed with individuality, with aesthetics, not enough with production and utility, if not with science sometimes. So you hear this criticism from the constructivists, von Duisberg, the left. In the opposing direction, the Bauhaus was routinely criticised for being socialist due to its machine-like, minimalist aesthetic. Conservative opinion, actually not just in Germany but around the world, was criticising the Bauhaus for being associated with the tearing down of luxury, the dismissive equation of beauty and aesthetics, and because they equated that with the old imperial order. So this was the critique from the right, throwing out the baby with the bathwater. This oscillating opinion of the Bauhaus occurred frequently, therefore, within its own right time, not subsequently, but it's been going on ever since. Even in her own book, Forgash, who's actually fascinated with the Bauhaus and wants to defend it, ponders how was it possible for the reverence accorded with the creative artists in 1919 to turn to scorn by 1928. So even within her own book, there's this puzzle about what happens. For Moholy, the idea, the vision of the stance would require, for instance, for him, a new social vision. So there's always this question of how it would be realised. And without a new social vision, he would argue, what would the Bauhaus vision look like? That is, if we hadn't achieved this new social vision, what would the Bauhaus be? Okay, does it require this new society? I just want to then take one example then to focus the rest of the paper. I've sort of sketched out the terrain of these various different possibilities. So I want to look at this book. If none of you have seen it before, it's not a surprise. It's one of the most obscure books in Bauhaus history of literature. So it's Ludwig Hirschfeld Mack. It's got Bauhaus, an introductory survey, and it's published in Melbourne. You can see there in '63. So it's published in Australia. It's one of the first English language books on the Bauhaus. So you sort of think there would be lots and lots of publications, but actually what happens is there's a slow rebuilding of the history that occurs. And so there's beginning to be a proliferation of them, but this is just the beginning of that process. The background to this document are quite fascinating. Hirschfeld Mack was a graduate of the Weimar Bauhaus, and you could see that he makes it clear this is a Weimar history. It's not about Dessau, and it's not about Berlin, which is a very short period. And he's one of the few, along with his peer Joseph Albers, who's one of the first to rise in the Bauhaus from being a student to teaching there. Okay. At the famous exhibition for the Bauhaus Week, he designed one of the key postcards for the Bauhaus Week, which are now still around the world. They're all collections, little postcards, but they're quite... you see them, if you look them up on the website, you'll find them all the time. And he debuted this work called... I forgot I included this morning. So, you know, he was very much taken up by the idea of the Bauhaus as something heralding this new order. The Bauhaus, of course, was sort of, because it had these Gothic pretensions, it was looking backwards and forwards at the same time. So this is one of its peculiarities as where it's positioned itself. But Hirschfeld Mack does respond to it. He's been in the war. He becomes a lifelong, World War I, he's a lifelong pacifist. Before he goes there, he studies with Herzl in Stuttgart, where Schlemmer went, where Itten went, and Itten's the one who sets up the preliminary course and wants to eventually set up a colour seminar, a specific colour seminar. And then he creates there's a lot of pressure on the Bauhaus in Weimar to actually come out and do things. So in the Bauhaus Week, the exhibitions of 23, the postcards are a big feature of it, but Schlemmer's theatre works seem to be some of the biggest hits of that week. And the other one is this thing here, the Farbenlichtspieler, where the colour light plays, that he creates. And this is here, this sort of ruler or something. So you're seeing the back of the mechanism. And this is what it looks like. And actually, his story is very much a Weimar model, because once the Bauhaus goes to Dessau in 25, Hirschfeld Mack stays in Weimar. Now, I think he did actually want a position to go to Dessau, but he doesn't get one. It doesn't continue anyway. But it's interesting that he does these colours. So I'll just show you a few of the slides so you can see them. What it does is project this, and some of these, he's looking at this whole idea of projection that was sort of three-dimensional. And so it's meant to be the next stage from painting, and Maholly was particularly fascinated by this because he hadn't really done these light space reflected by that stage, or he was working on it. So he sees these as a first prototype of a new focus on art. The whole theme at the first phase is art and technology together. So this is seemingly the new media after painting. It's sort of spatial too, and they project forward, and then you have these things. So there's these different plays, and they're cued to music, so he composes music for them as well. Now, another one's been recreated recently. There's one in... I've been trying to see this. This is very peculiar history, and that's why I want to go to Munster to see. I've tried for 10 years to see them, and it's a very peculiar situation. I went to Bolzano and it was closed, and then I went to the Bauhaus Archive in Berlin is closed. Of course, the centenary, but it's closed for about 2 or 3 years. It's like the airport, it's getting longer and longer when it's ever going to open. And so they recreated this one, but I've spoken to the guy who designed it, but it's sort of a little bit more computer looking, so you can see that it slightly changes when developed. This is what it looks like. And the first one he recreated, that goes back to this book. He's in Melbourne and he's asked by the Bauhaus archive, at this stage is in Darmstadt, to recreate this machine. And the Bauhaus archive lost it. And the only reason we know it was there is because the PowerPoint plug is an Australian one, and that's all that's left. The rest of the machine is gone. So all these things are reconstructions after the first short map. There's so far 2 of them, although one might already be missing again, so we don't know. There's a very peculiar history to these machines. So I want to go to Munster to see if one at least is still alive. So while he's there, as I mentioned, Johannes Itten, many of you may know, he's got a haircut like me, and he's doing mulching food and doing experimental food practices, and he's getting students to do breathing exercises. So before you come to a class, we'd all have to stand up and breathe properly, if you want to hear my lecture, so if we did it Itten style. But Itten gets sacked before the colour seminar, right? So Herschel Mack ends up doing the first colour seminar. Okay? So he's got quite an interesting career at the Bauhaus. So he's doing the spinning tops too, because he's interested in colour, and they're still sold today. So this toy is one of the long enduring Bauhaus toys that have been created. So they're there for kids, and they've got different tops, and you can see how colour works. So it's a very practical exercise of colour mixing. This is sort of things he was doing in the colour classes at the Bauhaus. And then he does 2 things that happen to make him go into obscurity. The first one is he moves from the avant-garde and then goes into art education. Okay, so he stays in Weimar, and he's really interested in the reform education movement, and ends up wanting to teach children. Sort of thinks that's the best place to start. And he develops this idea of material cultures, and basically what it's about is that you go back to basics and you construct things and you put them together again. And so he does this for the Lantern Festival here, or Lantern Fest. You can see him create all these sort of geometric, sort of Milanovich type sort of kites, so all these children becoming young avant-gardists. Then every place that he's working in Germany, he starts off at Vickersdorf, and then he ends up, that gets closed by the Nazis, and then he goes to Frankfurt under Oder, where he's working again with Schlemmer, and the Schlemmers are there. Then he goes to Kiel, and progressively all these places are being closed down. And the problem is he's got children, and his wife is suffering from multiple sclerosis, so he has to sort of work somewhere, so he ends up going to England. And he works with children's and workers' education in England. And this is an example of this material cultures thing. So all these instruments are handmade. So the students make the instruments, and again it's colour-coded. So this poor little fellow who looks very unhappy, he's there having a colour-coded thing, and what happens is that all the other children don't have to learn musical notes, they play by colour. They can do red, blue, and then they work out these chords. And they can learn to play quite fairly relatively sophisticated music, some of the kids there. And this is Herschel Mack with his piano accordion. So he's moving into progressive education, but doing it then, and the links through that picking him up work in London. And he's also, by this stage, becoming a Quaker, so the Friends Society is also another link for work. What happens then is when war is declared, and all the European countries are overrun, Churchill sort of panics a bit, and actually just decides everyone should be interned, whether they're pacifist, Nazis, whatever. Everyone has to be interned because he's worried about fifth colonists. This is the only reason that it's going to be taking over everything so quickly. So he doesn't want this to happen in England. So everyone gets interned. You probably know that, this happened to Hartfield, to Herschel, Mack, etc. In his case, he's on the Isle of Man doing these sorts of works with these figures roaming the landscape. And then he gets interned, and that's how the Australian connection occurs. Not because he voluntarily goes, they all get interned, well, not all of them, but all these people get interned on a ship, and they're meant to go to Canada. But what happens is one of the ships leaving before this one gets mined, and they have to come back to Liverpool, and then they decide, okay, we'll send them south. So the people on this ship didn't even know where they were going. Some of them worked out after a while that they were heading a different direction. And they kept them all under board, and this created this great big scandal because there wasn't enough beds for some people had to sit on the floor, and there was toilets were just buckets and they were falling over, and it was a horrible experience. And everyone treated them really bad, and they threw things overboard. Like one fellow had a red violin, and the British soldier just threw it overboard. So already by the time these people arrived, the first droppers, they dropped the ones who were Italian or German fascists and put them in a special camp. The others went around to Sydney. And then they were put straight on a train and sent as far west as possible. And this is where it has a very awkward parallel to a situation that's happening in Australia now, where what happens, they couldn't tell who was a Nazi and who was a pacifist or who was a refugee, so they just put them all in an internment camp. So what he's portraying here is, when they first arrived, it was, you can see the camp here, it's barbed wire with these watchtowers with showing light, and there was a major dust storm. So you can imagine you sit halfway around the world and this thing just flares up and they can't see anything, it's burning their eyes and then nothing. So this is for day one. Okay, so he creates a couple of visions of these sort of huge cloud-like monsters that devour them. And this is his first Christmas card. This is interesting too. This becomes quite well known in Australia actually, and it comes up again because we have a situation on an island where now we can't tell who's a terrorist or who's a refugee, so again put them all in camps. So that this history is not progressed or anything, it's just repeated. And this is him looking at the barbed wire, and this constellation you can only see in the southern hemisphere. It's called the Southern Cross. So it's a very specific focus to, he made these cards for people in the internment camp. This is a very long detour to explain why this book occurs, and it's quite interesting why it occurs, but I'm just doing this detour. One other character, this is a postcard too, another one is called Georg Telschler. He changed his name to George Adams because no one could pronounce his name, but he did this postcard for Bauhaus Week, and he seems very closely associated with Schlemmer. And he's one who got out and was, because the British realised, the Australians didn't want them there, but they realised they were no threat. And so almost by the time they arrived, people were being released. Herschel Mack was in internment longer because he's a pacifist, and the easiest way out was to join the army. Telschler was allowed to go back for some reason, but this was precarious too because the first ship to take people back was bombed, and the ship sank, so they all died. So he still decided to go, but he created one work in Australia. I mean, he taught classes and that in the internment camp, but he made this counterfeit money. And it was so well done and realistic that people actually didn't realise at first that it was counterfeit. But he actually did write on the back that it's only Camp 7, the internment camp at A, and he put all these sheep on the back and Camp 7 there. So this is like Australia for them. And the reason was, he said that they liked the food that they got, but it was constantly lamb, 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 lamb. So he has this repetition. But in here, Telsha's sort of a funny guy. He was allowed out of camp to do a signpost and had to say no parking. And he did it one letter at a time per day because he was allowed out of the internment camp and it was the longest no parking sign ever designed. But you can see he's quite playful, and within the barbed wire is the letter of a song, We Are Here Because We Are Here, and it goes all around it, and it's basically, why are we are here because we are here, because we are here, and it's buried in, and this was seen as seditious too, so this was also caused trouble. So back to Herschel Mack, he finally gets out of internment camp, and actually the problem for him is he's offered a job by Albers. Maholly offers him a job in Chicago. He's offered a job in Black Mountain, but during the war there's no chance of going, the visas aren't allowed, etc. So he ends up working at Geelong Grammar and stays there. So he actually thinks he's very happy there and wants to stay there, so he ends up doing most of his career in art education and then at this UNESCO conference. And what happens then, there's two major periods in the archive you'll see of material for him. The first phase is when they're all in exile and everyone in the avant-garde's connecting up to everyone and trying to say where you can get a job and so forth. The second phase is after the war, and people then are beginning to ask for documents or works, and they're reconstructing the Bauhaus history. And this is what leads up to this point of this book. So he's been asked to reconstruct the Farbe Nichtspiele and the colour light plays, and he's asked for documents too, and so there's a real concerted effort. There's galleries asking from Switzerland, from Germany, from various places. The Americans have already got quite a bit of stuff out of him, so there's quite a bit of collection in Harvard as well. So everyone's contacting from various places, but he's content to stay there, and this leads up to this book being published. Okay. So as I said, it focuses on the Weimar period. It also, the outlines of Herschel Mack's history are very conventional too, in a Bauhaus style. He sets out, he includes his colour light plays catalogue, and in that, he expresses concern about the overly subjectivist orientation of modernist aesthetics. And what he says is this comes at the expense of traditional communal cultural values. And this is the whole focus, if you like. This is not an uncommon Bauhaus sort of reference. Because art had lost the common frame of reference in society, he argues, this was formerly provided for religion. There was this open question in the modern era, what anchors it? What anchors art to society? So it lost its role, he says, as a strong means of cohesion and expression for the population at large. This is where it leads into the art and technology thing, because it sort of sees this as a way of overcoming this divide. At the same time, he also had qualifications about a completely individualist emphasis in education, because it also needed to focus on the common good or collective purpose. So all these themes are being put together in this book, so it's like a summation of these classic Bauhaus themes. This is reflected too in the principles of forming the Bauhaus teaching exercises, so the colour seminar, the whole focus of the individual or subjective responses with the universal laws. Indeed, much of Bauhaus informed teaching sought to mediate then between the individual and the universal, the part with the whole, or to bring the individual into awareness of extra individual propensities. And that comes out in two main focuses of Herschel Mack's teaching, in the colour seminars and the material studies. They're both exercises. And Bauhaus rhetoric, of course, doesn't really talk about the focus so much. It really focuses on the idea of the universal necessity, fundamental laws, that sort of thing. So Herschel Mack's book coincides with this effort to recreate, and it really coincides with the founding of the Bauhaus archive in Darmstadt, which is now in Berlin. Okay. Gropius, when this archive was opening in Darmstadt, Gropius proposed to Herschel Mack to use an excerpt from his 1961 speech for the opening of the archive, and he said that could be the foreword for his book, this one here. Gropius offered some really quite intriguing amendments, though, to the text that Herschel Mack prepared. The first one is not really remarkable. What he suggests is that the first point he makes is you should conclude more on Moholy-Nagy, and he says, I think his book, Vision and Motion, is perhaps the most important writing about the Bauhaus, and particularly for educational purposes. The other key point, and remember he sends him a text, he translates his German Herschel Mack into English, and Gropius writes two key amendments in the margin. He includes the word missing coherence in it, and then the other key change is to emphasise, he writes this as well, that the work of the Bauhaus, this is in early 60s, should be continued and broadened. Okay, so it's not this thing's finished, it's something to be extended. So when you get these amendments together, the amended text reads that the core idea behind the Bauhaus is, quote, the restoration of a missing coherence in modern life, which sort of reflects Herschel Mack's major ethos in his teaching as well. So Gropius is also pointing to this diminishing desire to draw together and crystallise the currents of the epoch. So as he's saying this, he's sort of saying we're losing the ambition to try and crystallise the whole idea of the epoch. Okay, by the 60s this is getting lost, therefore the Bauhaus vision could be extended. Okay. So behind the Bauhaus aspiration you hear echoes of, Schiller's aesthetic state, the focus on wholeness and diversity, and also the attribute to achieve some feasible unity of art, technology and science. And there's also hints of William Morris and the whole idea of the 19th century idea of restoring pleasure in work. So all these themes are playing there. So you find in Herschel Mack, he has a paper that he writes in 1954 called Creative Activity in the Study of Materials. And he writes, our future demands human beings who have the logical and truthfully working brain of an engineer, and at the same time develop the soul and mind of an artist. Okay. So the introductory survey of his also appears in the wake of the Ulm fiasco. So while I'm saying that they're saying that the Bauhaus stance has not been achieved, at the same time there have been a series of institutions that have been trying to, after the war, to reinstate the Bauhaus idea. And in fact, it never happens, okay? So the new College for Design, or short for Gestaltung, opened in 1953 in Ulm, with the stated ambition of reviving the Bauhaus program. There were even preliminary discussions about calling it Bauhaus Ulm. Former Bauhaus Dessau student Max Bill was its founding director or rector from 53 to 56. And as it turns out, Herschel Mack had a connection to Ulm as well. His youngest daughter, Ello, was married to Amano de Leuven, who was the chief assistant of Bill in Ulm. Okay? So he knows exactly what's going on there. The Bauhaus idea and institution, however, was not revived. In a letter to Herschel Mack, dated 15th of August 1957, Gropius explains to Herschel Mack that Bill had already left. Gropius writes, as expected, he made a lot of mistakes, and there is no successor to avoid making more mistakes, end quote. As the French design historian Alain Fideli argues, what you find is the unitary structure sought by the Bauhaus, art and technology, goes through a number of changes. At the new Bauhaus in Chicago, he argues it became more focused on art, science and technology, and by the time you get to Ulm, art is completely left out of the picture, and he sort of says, science and technology, a new unity would be its slogan. And he's very wry about this, sort of, he doesn't think it's a very good thing, but that's exactly what happened. This sort of explains some of the tenor of some of the other contributions in Hirschfeld Mack's book, because what he does is ask all his friends, quite famous friends, to contribute something, not just Gropius. There's an extended quote by his old friend Annie Albers, also from her book on designing from '59, and in it she says, quote, "Wholeness is not a utopian dream. It was something we once possessed, and now it seems largely to have been lost," end quote. Bereft of a single, all-inclusive form that embodies the whole of our needs, Albers continues, she said she fears we're only left with separateness. Separateness, segregation and fragmentation. So the missing coherence that Gropius was talking about, something that embodies all human needs, was like, if you like, become by this stage, the black hole of the Bauhaus ambition. It both motivated it and it devoured its energies. Some were wary of it, right from the beginning. Schlemmer, in 1937, noted, "We moderns are not and cannot be Greeks or Egyptians or devout artists of the Middle Ages, because the social and spiritual foundations of that period have long since vanished." If the Bauhaus idea were not realised, other Bauhausers such as Albers, Gropius and Hirschfeld Mack feared that the prospects, if it wasn't realised, were unremittingly bleak. And it's this melancholic shadow that we find over this book, even though Hirschfeld Mack's a very positive, optimistic sort of character. But there is this undercurrent of the Bauhaus idea has never been achieved, but the consequences of it are really terrible. So he quotes Wilhelm Wagenfeld, who's also a fellow Weimar Bauhaus student with him, and he says in 1960, in quite strange English in a way, that our industrial products are actually nothing but a waste of labour and materials. To preserve a system of production, we're preserving a system of production which acts destructively and increasingly deteriorating. Say it. The other person there was Albers that he quotes as well. So, without the Bauhaus idea or stance, it's almost like it's suggesting, like if you think of Wagenfeld's quote, we're frozen in space between utopia and dystopia. It's not too far away from sort of things that would soon be realised later, like in Superstudio. Faced with the conditions of rapid urbanisation after World War II, they were faced with the consequence of mass housing became the prospect of building without architects, without design. That is, real estate developers constructing mass public housing projects without the bother of designers at all. This is what Wagenfeld's also pointing to. So the letter of protest last October about the Bauhaus and its stance did try to identify something crucial in the Bauhaus history, that is its stance. It's clearly against right-wing populism and radicalism in Germany. Its implicit agenda is cosmopolitan and the defence of the critical and the explorative. But what I've tried to show then is that the left-wing or progressive attitude has not been consistent necessarily. There's no real stance. Sometimes it's pro-production and sometimes not. But it seems like more the focus up to today has moved more to the aesthetic side. We like the Bauhaus that's more critical, explorative, aesthetic. We moved away from the productive side. So no one ever talks so much about Hans Meyer anymore. That's Basel. So the stance also is oscillated between these polarities it sought to solve. This was part of its dilemma. It was trying to create this. In the last 15 to 20 years, the emphasis on the applied or instrumental approaches to creativity, design, even university research has been the one that's been predominant. The appeal of the Bauhaus stance suggests there is another aspect to that stance, which has always been there, but that's the one we seem to respond to more warmly. It could be summarised as a focus towards the life worth living, so you're not interested in exploring. Such an appeal was right there in the beginning in its manifesto. For us today, it seems the paradoxical dimension of its ambition is the one that proves most telling. This is, for us, the legacy. 100 years later, it is perhaps more evident that this paradox, it's just that we are still struggling with the same dilemma and the realisation of what this means for us today. This leaves one possibility I'd like to throw open to conclude with. The progressive understanding of the Bauhaus stance is perhaps shaped by its failure. The failure to realise its ultimate vision, the missing coherence. And in that failure is where we're beginning to find our critical compass when we talk about the Bauhaus stance today.
Thank you.